I've titled this course, this talk, An Analysis of a Lancaster Navigator's Logs and Charts. So for those who have never seen a navigator's logs and charts, I suppose we'd better have a look and see what they look like. This is an air navigator chart and its chart work. And as you can see, it's considerably different from a mariner's chart, because a mariner tries to put as little as possible on his chart so that he can use it time and time again. But an air navigator usually only uses a chart once per flight, or once for every flight, and afterwards it's handed in. So he's able, and indeed he must, put on many more construction lines than you would see on a maritime chart. Let's have a look at the log. Similarly, a maritime log would probably be in a book, and it would remain with the ship until the ship was eventually broken up. But an aviator's log is really just a piece of paper, piece of brown, normal paper, probably about 12 inches by 17 inches, a bit like this one here. And you're allowed to write on the back as well. And again, you fill it in before and during the flight, and afterwards it's handed in for analysis and is kept for records. If we look at it in a little bit more detail, at the very top, you can see the top line is basically just the aircraft, the pilot's name, the navigator's name. Top left is the weather forecast. Top right are the times of risings and settings of the sun and the moon and the planets. Below that is where the navigator rates his watch, and below that are the orders. Next thing down is the route. And on the left-hand side, you've got details like the track required and the heading necessary to get that track. On the right-hand side, you've got the airspeed, the ground speed, and the distances, and the estimated time of arrival. In the middle is the actual route. If we go down another stage towards the bottom of the picture there, we've got what actually happens just before or during the flight. So you would log your pre-takeoff checks there. And then on the left again, you've got your tracks required, the headings to achieve those tracks, the winds that you're using. On the right-hand side, you've got the distances, the speeds, the time you're going to take on each leg, and when you expect to get to the next turning point. But one of the most interesting bits from the researcher's point of view is if you look at the middle column, because the middle column gives the details of everything that happens on the trip from the navigation point of view, and also if you're the only chap with a pencil and paper, anything else anybody else wants you to write down as well. So it's a marvelous piece of premium research, because maybe you can read books about World War II, you can listen to veterans' reminiscences, but within this column is what was actually happening and being written down at the minute by the chap who was there. I ought to say a little bit about how I got these charts. Several years ago now, I was going around the small Heritage Museum at RAAF Waddington in Lincolnshire. And on the wall, there was framed a navigator's log and chart. And I spent rather a long time looking at this. And the curator came and said, "You're spending a long time looking at that." And I said, "Yes, I'm very interested." He said, "Well, as a matter of fact, in the cupboard over there, we've got a folder with a World War II Lancaster Navigators, a complete set of his logs and charts for his tour of operations on 463 Squadron in 1944-45. Anyway, I arranged to borrow them and took them home and started to look at them. I had to be very careful, because certainly some of the earlier trips, the logs were on rather cheap wartime paper. They'd also dried out over the years, and they were starting to get a bit frayed around the edges. The charts weren't too bad. Another problem with even some of the later logs was folding damage. So I thought, well, I can't work with these really. And I took them down to the local post office where there's a photocopier, and I photocopied as much as I could afford on A3 colour photocopy, and I worked on those. I took the actual charts back to Waddington. So I ought to say thank you very much to the Heritage Museum at Waddington for letting me borrow them, and thank you very much to the chap who actually filled the charts in, then the logs in. So perhaps we ought to go now and actually have a look at the crew who completed these charts. And it was the McRae crew on 463 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, a Royal Australian Air Force squadron embedded within No. 5 Group Bomber Command, flying from RAAF Waddington in Lincolnshire. Captain's name was Ken McRae, Australian. 5 of the crew were Australians, 2 were RAF. The chap who filled the logs in is Flying Officer D. Pybus. And I did manage to find online a photograph of the crew. So before we see that, though, this is a photograph of Ken McRae, DSC, Royal Australian Air Force, the pilot. And I must say I'm very grateful to the McRae clan website who've allowed me to use these photographs. Here's a photograph of the crew. This was taken either just before or just after their 30th operation in the aircraft that they flew quite frequently. And this is the crew. The captain is fairly obvious because we've just seen his photograph. The mid-upper gunner, Flight Sergeant Lynch, is also obvious because he's the only flight sergeant. But which is D. Pybus, and what does D stand for? Well, here's where I'll just give you a few seconds for you to choose. But here's where, again, the McRae family were able to help me, and they were able to tell me which the crew members were. And here you are, you see, this is Flying Officer Pybus, and his name was Dennis. So that's Dennis Pybus. Now, the photographer must have decided they weren't smiling enough. They did look a bit miserable on that one. So on the same day, another photograph was taken. Hope you can see the top there. And I don't know if you can notice, but Brennan, the chap in the middle, the flight engineer, has got an amazing grin on his face. Not quite sure why, but in fact, if you have a look, Plimpton and Pybus have actually changed places. And now we can tell Pybus is a navigator because he's got his great big navigator's bag by his feet with all his nav equipment in it, which proves the old adage that navigators carry all the gear and the pilots carry nothing but responsibility. The crew flew 32 ops in all. They actually flew 33 because one of the trips they were called back halfway to enemy territory, so that didn't count. The first op was 14th of September 44, and their last one was the 7th of April 45. Ken McRae actually flew an extra trip because it was a custom for newly arrived pilots to fly as an observer, as an 8th man in an experienced crew, to take a look at Germany before he actually flew over there with his own crew. Pilot was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross after Trip 8 to Bremen because they were attacked 5 times altogether, and by his flying and his corkscrewing he managed to evade all those aircraft, and as a result of that he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Here are his medals. I won't go through all of them, but you can see the one on the extreme left is the Distinguished Flying Cross, and if you don't recognize the one on the extreme right, it's because it's the Australian Service Medal given to all Australian servicemen in World War II. Norway. This is a picture of the aircraft they flew more times than any. Jig, Oboe, William, using the 1944 phonetic alphabet, taken in January 1945. You can see it was quite a nasty winter that winter. Another thing to notice, if you have a look just behind the bomb bay, before the fins, underneath, there's a radar blister. That blister is probably empty, and we'll talk about why that was later on. Now, when I got these charts, also in them was a set of A3 paper pages, which someone had actually done a basic analysis of what happened to the crew. And I suspect it had to be Pybus, because some of the stuff that was written, you could have only written it if you were actually there on the day. But we surmise that they did 32 trips altogether, 10 by day and 22 by night. The average duration of each trip was 6 hours, and the average distance was about 1,100 miles. The average error in the time on target, in other words, how close they were to the time they were actually told to get there, was 1 minute. And it was very important. That was a good result, but it was also important that they did keep to time, and we'll talk about why that is later on. Now, the navigator couldn't really see an awful lot out because he was sitting at a table navigating, but the rest of the crew could. So all the time they were flying along, they could see aircraft being shot down, and they reported this to the navigator, and it was a navigator's job to write it down in his in the log, and we'll see a lot of that. And they actually saw 35 aircraft shot down during their tour of 32 operations. The longest trips were to Munich in southeast Germany, 1,800 miles, 9.5 hours. And then towards the end of their tour, they did 2 trips to the Politz oil refinery, which is about 45 miles northeast of Berlin, just over the Polish border, where the Germans were producing artificial fuel from coal dust. And those trips were about 1,800 miles, and they were 10.5 and 10 hours. The worst trips, as far as Pybus was concerned, was the Bremen trip, where they were attacked 5 times by fighters. The first Politz trip, a long way away, and of course you've got to remember this was the winter of 1944-45, and the problem was always fog when you got back. So they took off from Waddington, and on the way back, they got a message, Waddington's gone out in fog, divert to Lossiemouth up in Scotland. So they started to go to Lossiemouth. And then they got a message saying, no, it's all right, you can land at Waddington. So they started to come back. And then they got another message that said, no, go to Lossiemouth. Well, by that time, they were getting really short of fuel. They worked out they couldn't possibly get to Lossiemouth. But they thought they might just make Lincolnshire. And they did just manage to scrape across the coast and land at Stribby, which is a little airfield, just a little bit right on the east coast of Lincolnshire. And as soon as they touched down, the engine stopped. Ship 25, he didn't like that. He was attacked by a fighter and he was airsick. Ship 28 to the Mittelland Canal on quite a famous day in the annals of air fighting, 21st of February 1945. They reckon they were surrounded by shot down aircraft, and they corkscrewed and escaped the famous or infamous, whichever way you look at it, Major Schnaufer. Now, Major Schnaufer was the top scoring German night fighter pilot. He actually claimed 9 victories on the 21st of February 45. 2 were in the previous morning, but 7 on the evening when he had a go at the McRae crew. This is a picture of their aeroplane, a Messerschmitt 110, and on the left is a picture of the crew. Schnofer's in the middle, Rumpelfahrt, the radar operator on the left, and Gansler, the gunner, on the right. Some observations of mine now. Well, I didn't have to go very far for their first 2 trips. The target was Le Havre. It was particularly demanding because Le Havre, the garrison at Le Havre had been holding out against the Allies for a long time, and the Allies were anxious to overcome it. So they were going to attack on the 11th of September, and they thought it was a good idea if on the 10th and 11th of September, just before the attack, Boer Command was allowed to bomb Le Havre to shake up the German defenders. But of course, the Havre was covered, was surrounded by Allied troops. So bombfall was critical. And I won't go into it now, but the regulations as to when and where they could make the bomb switches live, open the bomb doors and close them again, so that nothing fell out of the bomb bay after they'd gone over the target, were very strict. The other important thing to notice about this trip was they landed on the Monday, on the 10th at 7 p.m. and they took off again at 5:30 on the 11th. Well, if you think they have to climb out, they have to shut the aircraft down, climb out of it, get back to ops, queue up, be debriefed, have a meal, and then probably by about 2:30 the next morning, they were going to briefings and planning the trip on the 11th. So they can't have had very much rest that night. They must have been worn out by the time they arrived, by the time they landed on the 11th. This is a little bit of the chart. You can see they came down across the south coast to B, to the target, to C, and a bit of southwest, southeast, southwest, a bit of northwest, and then back north. Not an awful lot on that, but I put it on as well just to show you the little kisses on there, the little crosses. Those are the G positions, the navigation aids they were using. The little triangles are their air positions from the air position indicator, which was a little mechanical device that did some of the plotting of where they were in the air for them. And the vector joining the two is where he could calculate the wind from. If you see, he's extended those vectors so he can get his big square protractor on it and actually measure the direction of the wind. Another observation. The first 30 trips were assessed and marked by the navigation leader, squadron navigation leader, or one of his lieutenants. And they were commented upon, and there was a percentage mark given for every trip. The early trips, the comments were mainly advice. The later trips were more sternly commented upon. So to give you an example, this is the leader's writing at the bottom of his first trip. I won't go into all of it, but just to point out that they said he didn't keep the system. Every squadron, every command, every group had a system, a standardized way of doing things. And if you didn't keep to the system, you got your fingers wrapped. Another important thing, it says, try and note your air position and the target position, you obviously got that, to work out the wind at the target, most important on German targets, because first of all it helped in analysing where your bombs fell afterwards, but also if you could get the wind back to group in the UK by wireless geography, group was keeping a running average of the wind and rebroadcasting it for any aircraft which had been unable to get a decent wind to put onto their bomb site. Towards the end, the remarks got a little bit stricter. For some reason we know not, the pilot decided that he wanted to be late along track. Actually about 3 minutes late. And the leader's comments at the end were, "Your instructions are to adhere to timing, i.e. the timing that we tell you, not as ordered," and I've put in brackets there, "by your pilot." So a little rap on the knuckles over that one. The reason why timing and track keeping was so important was because of the way the Germans set up their defence system. This is known as the Kammhuber line, after the German general who was head of air defence, the Luftwaffe general, who set it all up. And I'd like to stress, I need to stress, that this is a very schematic diagram. It didn't really look like this. It was spread out over a much more complicated area. But this gives a good impression of basically how it worked. Also, after D-Day, of course, the whole thing was contracting towards Germany itself. They didn't have quite so many defences along the coast. So first of all, they had an early warning system, as we see. Can't find the pen now. Anyway, along the coast, they had early warning radars. Oh, this is working. Thank you, Claire, looking after me. And then inland, they had little boxes called Himmelbetts. It's actually German for four-poster bed or covered bed. And they're little boxes. And in these little boxes, they had, at the time when all this was going on, 2 fighters. And they also had the early warning radars, and they also had a couple of target tracking radars called Würzburgs. And the idea was that one Würzburg would lock onto its fighter, and the other one would find a bomber after being warned by the early warning radars. And the signals would be sent back to headquarters, where the 2 routes would be plotted, and they would try and bring a fighter in towards a bomber until the bomber could either see it, either visually or using its radar. Now, the advantage of this system initially was, when Bomber Command used to send off crews, they used to tell them what the target was, and they more or less used to let them pick their own route. So you would get bombers coming through lots of these little boxes, all going to the same target, but coming through lots of little boxes. Now, those little boxes could only attack 6 aircraft an hour. But because there were several boxes were being used, they could attack several bombers. So Bomber Command then came up with a tactic known as the bomber stream. And what they did, they crammed all their bombers into one long stream, which went through one box. It's a bit like the scout game, British Bulldog. If all the scouts rush through and you've only got a couple of defenders, you can't catch very many. And that was the idea. You did lose some bombers, but not as many as if they were all going through different boxes. So to do that, they needed to be able to keep very close to the desired track, for which they needed a good navigation aid, and they actually were using a system known as G, which we'll talk about in a minute. You also have to be very accurate with your timing. First of all, the aircraft were very close together, so you didn't want them bunching up, otherwise they'd be even closer together and then there'd be gaps. The other reason the timing needed to be almost perfect was because the target indicators, which they used to illuminate the target and direct the aircraft to the target, they didn't burn for all that long. So you had to get there while the indicators were still burning. So there we are. I should just let you have a read of that, and I'll try and remember where to rip this out. So if you wandered off track or you became a straggler, you were a sitting duck really, because you were going through a different box and everyone was looking at you. We go on now to the Bremen trip. here we are. He's sitting by his desk and he's writing, and he must have had a report from one of the crew. He said, what's he saying? They've seen an aircraft, says aircraft going down, starboard inner on fire, starboard outer smoking. And then they're attacked. And they're attacked 4 times. And they're corkscrewing. And then a bit later on, and then he gets on with the navigation again. And then a bit later on, they're attacked again. And then they see another aircraft shot down. And just look at the quality of this printing. They're being attacked, they're corkscrewing. And this printing, it is perfect. Why? Was it the discipline of the 1920s and 30s education system where children did have to print really neatly? Was it the rigour of the navigator training and the subsequent squadron assessment where you had to print neatly, otherwise they couldn't understand it and you're in trouble? Or was it a measure of the personnel in Bomber Command? Perhaps it was a measure of all 3. But, going back to comments by the navigation leader, they'd just been attacked by fighters 5 times. They'd seen a lot of aircraft shot down. The pilot's flying was so good, they gave him the Distinguished Flying Cross. And at the end of it, the nav leader says, I think you should check your air position indicator with a manual air plot wind velocity before relying on it. Absolutely. Quite a sound and systematic trip. But you've got to remember that these chaps as well had probably done maybe a full tour of operations. The leader might have been on his 2nd tour of operations. So he'd done all these trips as well. All observations. All flight plans started from overhead base at a particular height and time. This was nearly always preceded by a what they call a radius action, a trombone, if you like, to the west-southwest, and then a G-homing back to overhead base. You might think, why did they do that when they were going off to Germany? Why did they go west? We can talk about that later on, perhaps in the question session. All the fixing, once you're en route, was 10-minute rapid G fixing. We'll talk about G as well, while within range, because G was a VHF range, so it was limited initially by line of sight, and also later by jamming as well. So while you're within G range, 10-minute G fixing. Although we like to think the idea of the Navigator going off with his Mark 9 double sections, there's no evidence of Pybus using any Astro at all during his tour. Neither is there any evidence of him using H2S bombing radar, mapping radar, although the aircraft still had the blister. The reason for that is because 5 Group decided to take their H2S out, we'll talk about why later, and put Loran in the aircraft instead of a different navigation aid. Also used were pinpoints from the air bomber, otherwise known as the bomb aimer, and radio bearings from the wireless operator. But they didn't appear to be used very often. But G was used a lot, so we ought to talk about it. It was a hyperbolic navigation aid, and it worked around about 20 megacycles, a bit above that, VHF. And there was a master and probably 2 slave stations, a B station and a C station, and sometimes a 3rd station, a D station. And what happened was the master station pinged off a signal, which went to the B, which was received by the B slave, and the B slave pinged off a signal. So if you were in an aeroplane, you would hear, you tuned into the right frequency, you would get the A signal followed sometime later by the B signal. And if you were to plot lines of constant time difference, you would get a series of hyperbole. So there we are. Those are the hyperbole. The red ones are from the B slave. Slightly later on, so the numbers were significantly different, you would get a similar set of hyperbole from the C slave. So if you were an aeroplane and you could measure the time difference on the B signal and the time difference on the C signal, and look at your chart, or you'd have a chart of the hyperbole, you could work out where the aircraft was. This is a picture of G equipment. On the extreme left is the aerial unit, in the middle is the receiver, and on the right is the indicator. If you notice, there's a funny little panel on the left of the receiver. It's the radio frequency unit, where the radio frequency signals came in. And the receiver could only cope with about 4 stations, and by this time there were more than one, what we call G, more than 4 G chains. So it was maybe necessary to actually change that little panel there. Here's one I made earlier. So you might have to change that in the air. So you could get it in easily if you notice the little spikes at the back which helped it go in. And this is what Pybus would have seen. The A signal fires twice as often as the B signal, so the B signal only replies to every second A signal. So the time base goes along the top line, it whistles back, it goes along the bottom line. So you start off, you get the A signal, then you get your B signal, forget the D signal for the moment. The thing flies back, you get the second A signal, and behind that you get a little baby signal flashing at you. That's known as the A ghost, so you can tell the difference between the first and the second A signal. And actually the ghost flashes a different code for each G chain, so you know which chain you're on. And then you get the C signal, which has actually been prompted by the first A signal. You can measure the time difference by expanding the scale even more, and you get little calibration pips stick up, and you actually have to count them. You actually have to count along, poking them with your finger and counting them to get the G reading. It was measured in G units. Each G unit was 66.66 microseconds. The D signal, when it was used, that responded to every A signal, not every other one. So that the D signal, so you know it was D, responded twice on each of the time bases. And here we are. This is an example. I've lost the top of my screen, so I can't tell you which trip it was, but it was on the 1st of November. And you see that at 1540, Pybus changed the RF unit, and he selected the RAAF chain, and he tuned in, and he got G units 48.5 and 38.91. So that must have been the D signal and the C signal. He plotted that on his RAAF G chart, and he got a position of 5201 north, 0540 east. He also plotted his air position, and he joined the two with the vector and got a wind. But one of the interesting things about these charts is, and even taking these photographs and putting presentation together, you see things you hadn't noticed before. Like if you look below, it says we're altering course for C with formation. And again, at C, changing course for the target with the formation. So this trip, it actually took off about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it landed after dark. But they went to this target, and 5 group went in formation. Oh, certainly the squadron did. So I hadn't noticed that before. It's amazing what you see on these charts, with these logs, when you look at them really closely. This is a picture of a G chart. I'm got to thank the International Bomber Command Center in Lincoln for this. It's a G chart of the eastern chain. The master, the A station, was at Daventry, which was the old home of the old BBC National Service, later the Home Service in the 1930s. And the B slave was up on the Lincolnshire walls at a place called Stuttgart, and you can see the hyperbola on there. Because as you flew away from Britain, the G signal would have got less and less. And the Germans very quickly learned how to jam G, so they would be jamming from Germany. And of course, their signal would have been getting stronger and stronger. So eventually, the G signals would disappear into the jamming. It looks, because it's a green screen, it looks a bit like grass, and that's what it was called. It was called grass. So you could only use G so far, probably as far as the Ruhr. Although later on, as the Allies started to push through Europe, they did have mobile G units, which were placed not far behind the front line, in order to push the G cover further. Other aids, H2S mapping radar, pretty basic in those days. It wasn't carried by 467, 463 squadron aircraft. The disadvantage was it could warn of the approach of a raid. And the Germans had a receiver called a Naxos receiver, which they had on the ground in the aircraft. It was believed that when they found out the Germans had it, it was believed they could actually use it to home onto individual aircraft. They probably couldn't. It probably wasn't that good, but it was certainly good enough to tell them when the bombers were coming, and it was certainly good enough to tell them to help them home onto the bomber stream. And of course, once you were in it, there were so many aircraft in it that you didn't really need your Naxos after that. 5 group was the first group to get Loran. It was like G, but it was only around about 2 megacycle frequency, lower frequency, so much greater range. Still relatively new in the autumn of 1944, and in his log you can see Pybus practicing with it on the return trips initially, and then he used it on longer trips when G was playing up. So he never, as far as I can see, he never used Astro. He probably never carried a sextant, which is strange because whenever you see a Mark 9 sextant advertised on eBay, they always claim it was used in a Lancaster. And in fact, I think, certainly for operations over Germany, I think very few were used in Lancasters. Radio direction finding from medium frequency beacons. He did use it once when nothing else was working. But let's go on and have a look at Loran. When he first decided to design Loran, the Americans took control of Loran, and they left the British to look after G. But if you notice, the dimensions of the kit is exactly, on the left, is exactly the same as a G set. So it was felt that if ever you wanted to swap them over, they would fit in the same hole. And there's a longer range, and it actually operated. There was a master station, and the first skywave, which bounced off the E layer in the upper atmosphere, triggered the signal from the slave. And that's why it was called Skywave Synchronized Loran, with the early kits. And if you look on the right, you can see it was compared to G, it was quite a complicated picture, so you needed a lot more practice to be able to use it than you did with a G set. The range, of course, was much better. So there was a line from Port Erroll in Scotland, the A station, and the slave was a deserter in Tunisia. And there's another line from Oran in Algeria to Apollonia in Libya, is it? Right. And the cover was ideal for farther into Germany, as you can see. But insofar as getting you home to Waddington on a foggy night, it wasn't much good at all. So basically what they did was they used G to get themselves started off on, give themselves a good start off, get a good wind and everything else. Then they went on to Loran, and then on their way back, they changed back onto G again for their homing back to Waddington. They had both sets in the aircraft. They didn't have to change them over while they were flying along. And here's Pybus doing a Loran fix. You can see he takes at 1950. He measures a time difference of 77.05 microseconds on the number 5 line, 3403 on the 4 line. I haven't got the Loran chart, but he obviously plotted that, and he got a lat long 46.33.5 north, 04.52.5 east. He took his air position, and he works out a wind. All that took a bit of time, so he didn't alter course for the next turning point immediately. He probably did what we call D-yard ahead, worked out where he'd be about 6 minutes ahead, and then from there he altered course to the next turning point. And here's a picture of that fix on his chart. You can see the little kiss. That's the fix. His air position, his actual air position, is down away to the southwest there, and the line joining the two with 3 arrows on is the wind. So there we go. And you can see the next Loran position a little bit farther on at what is that, 20.05, and then another one farther down. So those are Loran fixes. He would take the Latin long off his Loran chart and replot them on his just normal plotting chart. Now, when we look at the log for the next slide, we'll see that, in fact, having all sorts of trouble with the G. So he must have got the radio operator to start taking bearings on medium frequency beacons. There was one down here, FB2, about halfway between Norwich and Ipswich. And there's another one up in Lincolnshire, FB3, just outside the little town of Louth. And you can see that coming up, he first of all at, what time is it, 11:38? He got a bearing from FB3 up in Lincolnshire there. And then at 11:48, he got a bearing off FB2. So he plotted his FB2 bearing, and then he moved his 11:38 bearing on FB3. He moved that 10 minutes flying up track to make it cross with the 11:48 line, and he got himself a fix. So he did use medium frequency beacons, but not very often, and only when nothing else was available. This is his mathematics. You can see, I think the radio operator must have taken this and written it down for him, because he's actually put them down the wrong way. They put it chronologically, they're back to front. At 11:38, FB3 bore 341 degrees relative. The true heading was 332. Add them together is 672. That's more than 360. So take away 360. FB3 bore 312 degrees true from the aeroplane, but he wanted to put his protractor on the radio station and plot a line from there. So he subtracted 180 degrees and he plotted 132 degrees from FB3. And he did the same for FB2. So that's the plotting of a medium frequency beacon. And if you have a look, he wasn't having a lot to look up the top there. The air position indicator was desynchronized. The G must have been giving him trouble. He thought he'd put it right. He had another try, and it was US again. So that's why he took the radio beacon, the radio fix, beacon fix. This is their first trip to Germany. Everyone was very keen. The bomber was very keen. And they were supposed to be coming up from the southwest there, up towards it, through D towards E, and then we're going to go southeast to F, and then southwest again to the target. And they're coming up there, and the air bomber says, and the target was Stuttgart, And he looks out and he says, I can see the target. It's only a couple of miles on the starboard wingtip where I put the circle. So they're in trouble a bit there, because that would have put them in trouble, because the bomber stream ahead of them would have been flying back southwesterly towards them. So what they did, they turned hard to starboard, crossed right across the bomber stream, the quickest way to get out of it, and then made a series of slow turns to the left and managed to bomb at the normal time, which seemed a pretty sensible thing to do, really. And you can see, there's a pair there. So, yeah. So the target's to the starboard, on the starboard beam, 2 miles, and so they alter course to 90 degrees, and then eventually they do a series of left-hand turns. The navigation leader didn't like it at all. This fictitious pinpoint by the bomb aimer confused the navigator. He was well on track and time and took the pinpoint as correct. And at the end of the trip, he has a little bit of advice. He says, treat pinpoints by the air bomber with extreme caution. Right, let's get on to the next one. If you could kill that for me, Claire, if you still there. Thank you. By this time, 5-group raids were controlled by a master bomber using VHF radio. And if you didn't have VHF, if your VHF wasn't working, you were in everybody's way. So basically, if your VFF failed, you didn't try to bomb, because you could have really messed it up for everybody else. They used windows, and their instructions for window was in that little orders thing that we saw on the just above the flight plan. They also used something called tinsel, which was they had a microphone in one of the engine compartments. And if the wireless operator managed to chance upon a German fighter frequency and there was someone talking on it, they used to turn it on and fill the frequency full of engine noise to hopefully confuse the controllers. So that was tinsel. So here's an example on the trip. It's put there, could not bomb VHF US. Here's another, here's a trip to Houffalize, which was a little town just to the north of, can't remember, Burgoyne. During the Battle of the Bulge, it was a German bottleneck, and so 5-group went to bomb it. But I've really put this on here. If you look at the bottom, you can see the Windows instructions between 5 East, the target, and something or other East. They had to stick out fighter window, 2 bundles a minute, an area flak window, 5 bundles a minute. So different frequencies. The one was for the ground-based radars and the older German air radars, and the other one was for the more modern German radars. I'm not going to go into it now, but if you were to take the time, you could see tremendous detail of the orders of the way that 5-group used to conduct their behavior around the target. But I haven't really time to go into that now. It would be be worth a whole new lecture on that. Here we are, he's coming down, a couple of interesting things. He's crossing a river, he's corkscrewing, but they stopped shoving out window because there's none left. And they commenced to use tinsel. So they did definitely use tinsel. There was scope still, nevertheless, despite what the navigation leader said, there were signs of captaincy. And on this particular night, they were, you can see where the target is, and they were coming up from the southwest again to G, to H, and then they were going to go up to the attack the target on a northwesterly heading. And they were about 14 minutes late, so they obviously weren't going to make their bombing slot. And the pilots said, I can see the target. He must have been able to see the target blazing away from miles away. So hoping it wasn't just something the Germans had lit, and it was a real target. In the end, he says, we're not going to make our bombing time. I'm just going to go for it. And he completely cut the corner off, and he went from sort of down here somewhere, and he went straight for the target. And have a look at the next side. You can see they're running 14 minutes late. Pilot decides he wants to go straight for it, so he alters course visually for the target, and he actually puts in the log, because again it's not standard. He said the pilot insists, but by doing so they managed to get and bomb the target within their time slot. Again, lots more detail to the left there about the way 5 Group did business over the target. Thank you, Trevor. Another interesting trip was the Rheydt trip. Rheydt is a little sort of twin town with Mönchengladbach, and it was a trip on which Guy Gibson was lost. Guy Gibson hadn't done a lot of flying since the Dams raid. He was really in a staff job, and he persuaded the air staff the group staff to allow him to fly one more trip as a master bomber in a Mosquito. And it was a 5 Group party again, so they were using a form of bombing where they actually aimed at an offset, and then they went so many seconds beyond the offset before they released the bombs. And the offset was marked by a chap in a Mosquito in a shallow dive. As the chap was diving down, part of the covers to stop the exhaust glaring flew off, and it spotted the chap's vision, night vision. And as a result, there was a lot of messing around while they had to try and remark the aiming point. So here's the bomber stream of maybe several hundred bombers all piling up one behind the other, wanting to bomb, and they didn't have the aiming point marked. So Master Bomber got them all orbiting to the port from the around the area of the aiming point. And eventually they got it all sorted out, and he called him in to bomb. But they were supposed to bomb at 21:37. You can see it on the right. They actually bombed at 21:55.5. That's 18.5 minutes later. So for 18.5 minutes, they were orbiting the aiming point. And of course, in those 18.5 minutes, it gave the German light fighters a chance to really have a go at it. And you can see later on, he says aircraft down ahead. And Gibson, he stuck around until the end of the raid, and he was lost on the way back. There was room for a little bit of humour, especially towards the end of the towards the end of the their tour, when they were feeling pretty experienced. And at the start of the trip, he goes through his checks to see everything's switched on and working. He goes G on, Z on, altimeter set, API set, so on and so forth, so on and so forth. He gets to the bottom and he says, morale, okay, question mark. So a little bit of scope for humour. So, drawing towards the end, if we analyse Pybus's logs and charts, we can see that by September 1944, Bomber Command operations had moved a long way from the idea put forward in early wartime publicity like Target for Tonight or Britain's Wonderful Air Force, a single aircraft disappearing into the night with a navigator clutching his sextant and rarely hitting the target. It became a well-oiled machine, sending a nightly torrent of heavy bombers overwhelming the defences with a disciplined system relying almost entirely upon electronic aids and wireless telegraphy and VHF communications. And there almost it ends. But we must say thank you to guys like these and so many who died, were injured and made prisoners of war. So thank you guys, and thank you very much for watching.